The night rain poured down. Cold gusts of wind blew through the empty street. The city was brightly lit, but under the old awnings, the silhouettes of lost people were still huddled in the darkness. Kevin drove slowly home after a long, tiring day, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his mind empty. Work had not been going well recently. His income was getting tighter. Expenses were starting to become a burden on his shoulders. It seemed like life had lost its color, only numbers and bills to pay. The car headlights passed a small street corner, where the sidewalk was wet. A man huddled under the awning of a closed shop. His clothes were dirty, his hair was disheveled, his body was thin from hunger and cold. His eyes were bewildered and a bit wary when he realized someone had stopped the car to look at him. Kevin didn't know why he hesitated. He should have kept going, ignoring everyone else, but something urged him to get out of the car. He opened the trunk, took out his only umbrella, and walked closer to the man. "Are you okay?" Kevin's voice echoed through the heavy rain. The man hunched his shoulders slightly, pressed against the corner of the wall. His sunken eyes looked at him inquisitively. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. I'm fine." It was clear that he wasn't okay at all. Kevin looked down at his feet. His shoes were torn and almost shapeless. His body was shivering from the cold. Kevin wasn't a rich man, but he still felt like he couldn't leave. "Come here." He held out his hand. "I'll buy you a meal." The man hesitated, his eyes flashing with the wariness of someone used to living in the dark. But hunger clearly defeated his pride. He slowly stood up and followed Kevin into a small restaurant nearby. Inside the shop, the warmth spread, causing his body to relax slightly. A young girl in an apron stood behind the counter, her eyes wide open, looking at the two curiously. She seemed to be working the night shift, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, her appearance agile, but her eyes filled with a bit of sympathy as she looked at the homeless man. Kevin ordered a portion of hot soup, a plate of steak, and a cup of coffee. He looked over at the man who was sitting with his head bowed, not daring to look up. "Can I order anything?" he whispered. "Of course." Kevin nodded. The waitress smiled slightly, quietly took the order, then turned away. A moment later, a hot meal was placed in front of the man. He picked up the spoon, but did not rush to eat. His hands were shaking as if he did not believe the truth before his eyes. Kevin quietly observed. "What is your name?" he asked. The man paused, his thin shoulders slightly tightening. "David." "How long have you been living like this?" David put down his spoon, his eyes distant. 4 years. 4 years. Kevin felt his heart sink. Just one moment in life can change a person's destiny. David recounted that he had been a businessman before, with a small company, a family, a full life. But then a wrong decision, a failed investment, a spectacular scam from a partner made him lose everything. Then his wife left, his friends turned their backs, his family cut off contact. He fell into homelessness, struggling on the streets, living on small change and the rare sympathy from strangers. Kevin was silent. He was not rich, nor was he a philanthropist, but his heart could not be indifferent. He could not turn away as if he had not heard David's story. "Do you want to start over?" he asked after a moment of thought. David looked up, his eyes misty. "I lost everything." "No one really loses everything. Just haven't found a new opportunity yet." David didn't reply, just lowered his head and continued eating. After finishing eating, Kevin bought him a set of clean clothes, then rented a cheap room for him to stay overnight. Before leaving, David held his hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I will never forget this." Kevin just smiled, patting him on the shoulder. He didn't help him, because he expected anything in return. But he didn't expect that this small action would change the fate of both of them. 5 years later. Kevin's life continued with his daily worries. His job wasn't too good, but it wasn't too bad either. He didn't remember David very well, just considered it a story of the past. Until one day, he received a strange letter. The sender, David Miller. He opened the letter in surprise, his eyes quickly skimming the first lines. "You may not remember me, but I have never forgotten you. You saved my life on a rainy night 5 years ago. I promised to repay you. Today, I want to fulfill that promise. Come to this address at 7 p.m. I have a surprise for you." Attached to the envelope was a small key. Kevin's heart trembled slightly. He didn't know what to think about this. Part of him felt curious. Part of him was afraid. But then, like an invisible force, he decided to drive to the location written in the letter. As he entered the luxurious hotel in the city center, a man in a neat suit walked toward him. Kevin stopped dead. David. But it was no longer the David of the past. He had changed completely. No longer the skinny, haggard, homeless man, but a successful businessman with a confident demeanor, sharp eyes, but still carrying sincerity. "I promised to repay you." David smiled. "And today, I will do it." Before Kevin could react, David placed a document in front of him. On it, there was a line in bold letters. "Partnership Agreement. I want you to be my partner," David said. "I have not forgotten the favor of the past. Now is the time for me to help you." Kevin stared at the contract in front of him, his mind blank. He didn't know whether to be happy or skeptical. This was too unexpected, too unbelievable. A person who had been homeless, abandoned by society, now sat before him with the appearance of a successful businessman, proposing a business partnership. Are you serious?" Kevin asked slowly, his voice trembling slightly. David chuckled lightly, his eyes shining with determination. "I've never been more serious." Kevin scanned the contract page by page, reading each clause. This wasn't a charity gift, but a real partnership offer. An opportunity. But why me? "You can find anyone. Someone more experienced, better than me." David shook his head, his sharp eyes looking straight at Kevin. "I can find hundreds of potential partners out there, but no one like you. You helped me when I had nothing left. When everyone turned their backs on me, you gave me a chance. I needed a partner I could trust completely." Kevin took a deep breath, his hands unconsciously tightening around the documents. He couldn't deny that the offer was really attractive. A chance to change his life. A turning point that could change his future. But at the same time, there were too many things he didn't understand. "How did you do it?" he finally asked. "How did you get up and achieve this success?" David was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. "It's a long story, and it wasn't easy." 5 years ago, after receiving Kevin's help, David was determined not to let himself sink into despair anymore. He used the little money Kevin gave him to rent a small room, buy a decent set of clothes, and start looking for a job. No one wanted to hire a homeless person with no permanent address, no assets or connections. He was rejected again and again, until he happened to meet Emma, the waitress at the restaurant that year. Emma remembered him clearly, the pained look in his eyes as he received his meal from Kevin. When she learned that he was looking for a job, she introduced him to work as a janitor at the restaurant. It wasn't a good job, but it was a starting point. David worked tirelessly, from cleaning, washing dishes to other odd jobs. He gradually saved up some money, enough to rent a better room. But most importantly, he began to regain confidence in himself. Then, one day, a real opportunity appeared. A customer came to the restaurant, a middle-aged man with a wealthy appearance, sitting at a table by the window. He accidentally dropped an important document when leaving. David picked it up and ran after it to return it. The man was Henry Lancaster, a famous investor. He was impressed by David's honesty and started talking to him. They talked about the past, about business, about the lessons David had gone through. And unexpectedly, Henry was the one who gave him a chance to start his life over again. With Henry's help, David got a small investment, enough to start a new project. But more importantly, he got a teacher, a real mentor. He threw himself into work, taking advantage of the valuable experiences and lessons he had. He not only rebuilt the company, but also turned it into a business that was stronger than ever. 5 years later, he not only regained everything he had lost, but also became an influential person in the business world. But no matter how much money or success he had, he would never forget the moment Kevin reached out to help him on that rainy night. Kevin was speechless after hearing the story. He couldn't imagine what David had gone through, a journey full of hardships, but also full of determination. "So, why don't you find Henry to cooperate?" Kevin asked softly. David laughed. "I do, but I want a companion I truly trust. Henry is an investor, but you are the one who changed my life." Kevin didn't know what to say. In front of him was a new path, a door leading to a future he never dared to think of. He looked at the contract again. Finally, he picked up the pen and signed the last line. David smiled with satisfaction. "Very good. Now we have a lot of work to do." But Kevin didn't know that. As he was about to sign, a figure stood in the distance, quietly observing. A middle-aged man, with a mysterious gaze. The storm wasn't really over, because David's past is not completely closed. Kevin didn't know that, as he signed the contract, a figure quietly left from a hidden corner of the hotel. The man looked to be in his 50s, with silver hair, a dignified appearance, but his eyes were full of danger. He picked up the phone. A low voice rang out on the other end of the line. He signed. "Let's start." On the other end, a soft laugh sounded. "Finally, old David is back. He can escape the past, but he can't erase what he's done." The man hung up, put the phone in his pocket, and slowly walked out of the hotel. The wind started to pick up, the tense atmosphere signaling an impending storm. Kevin walked out of the hotel, his mind still reeling from the events that had just happened. From an ordinary office worker, he suddenly became the partner of a millionaire, a person he had helped when he had nothing left. Everything happened too fast, too unexpected, but also too attractive to refuse. David followed, patting him on the shoulder. "You don't regret it, do you?" Kevin chuckled. "Probably not, at least until I understand this job better." David nodded. "Don't worry, I'll help you step by step. But first, we need a dinner to celebrate." They arrived at a fancy restaurant, where David had reserved a table. In the warm light, Kevin finally felt less nervous. He and David began to chat about work, about upcoming plans. But before the meal could even end, a strange man walked up to their table. David immediately froze, the smile on his face fading. The man was tall, wearing a black suit, his sharp eyes looking straight at David. He pulled out a chair, calmly sat down without asking for permission. "Long time no see, David." His voice was slow, but there was a distinct menace in it. David clenched his fists. "I didn't expect to see you here." Kevin frowned, sensing that something was wrong. "Who are you?" The man turned to Kevin, a knowing smile on his face. "I'm the man who helped David get everything, and the man who made him lose everything." Kevin was stunned. "What do you mean?" David took a deep breath, his eyes darkening. "He's Richard Grant, the man who betrayed me." Richard laughed. "Oh, don't say that. I just did what any businessman would do. Take opportunity when others make mistakes." Kevin sensed the tension in the air. He turned to David. "What does he want?" Richard slowly placed a file on the table, pushing it toward David. "I heard you were coming back, and I thought we should catch up. You owe me a debt, and I'm here to collect it." David didn't touch the file. "I don't owe you anything," Richard smirked. "No? Then open it." Kevin glanced at David, who hesitated for a few seconds before opening the file. When he saw the contents, his face paled. Kevin looked down. There were documents about a previous investment, unclear numbers, embezzled funds, and a copy of the contract with David's signature. "What is this?" Kevin asked, feeling nervous. David clenched his fists, his voice low. "It's a trap." Richard chuckled. "It doesn't matter if it's a trap or not. What matters is, if these documents get out, your reputation will be ruined. And I guess your new partner will be in big trouble too." Kevin felt a chill run down his spine. He was blackmailing David. David clenched his fists, his voice turning cold. "What do you want?" Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp. "I want you to give up everything. Go back to the shadows, disappear, and never dare to set foot in the business world again." Kevin looked at David, waiting for his reaction. A long silence fell over the table. But then, David suddenly smiled. "What if I refuse?" Richard raised his eyebrows. "Then tomorrow, all these documents will be in the newspapers." Kevin felt his heart pounding. If these documents were made public, David would not only lose his reputation, but also face legal action. But he also realized one important thing. David was not afraid. David looked straight at Richard, his eyes sharp. "Do you think I'm not prepared when I come back?" Richard frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" David slowly took out his phone and opened a recording. The voice rang out clearly. "I want you to give up everything. Go back to the shadows, disappear, and never dare to set foot in the business world again." Richard's face paled. David smiled faintly. "You just ruined yourself." Richard's hands clenched into fists. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "What do you think this recording can do to me?" David shrugged. "Maybe not enough to put you in jail, but it's definitely enough to make you lose all your business partners. You will have no credibility in the business world." Kevin felt excited when he saw Richard's face change. He had been hit back at the table. Richard stood up abruptly, throwing a hateful look at David. "You will regret this." David raised his eyebrows. "We will see." Richard said nothing more, just left the restaurant resentfully. Kevin turned to David, breathing a sigh of relief. "When did you prepare that recording?" David smiled. "I knew he would come looking for me. Richard is not the type of person who will let me go back without causing trouble." Kevin nodded, but he still felt uneasy. He had a feeling that things were not over yet. And he was right. Because that night, when Kevin left the restaurant, he discovered that a stranger was following him. Kevin walked faster, a sense of unease creeping into his every step. He wasn't a suspicious person, but tonight's events made it impossible for him to ignore this detail. The stranger was walking at a certain distance behind him, not close enough to be suspicious, but not too far away to be considered a coincidence. He stopped in front of an open coffee shop, pretending to search for something in his pocket. At that moment, he glanced through the reflective glass. The other man stopped too, but instead of entering, he stood in a hidden corner, took out his phone, and whispered something. Kevin didn't hesitate any longer. He immediately entered the coffee shop, going straight to the cashier. The young employee looked at him curiously when she saw that he seemed in a hurry. "I'll have an espresso," he said, lowering his voice. "And can I borrow the back exit of the shop? I think someone is following me." The waitress paused, but after a moment of thought, she nodded and gestured for him to follow. Kevin walked into the small kitchen of the shop, where the smell of coffee mixed with the heat of the coffee machine. The waitress pointed to the back door, which led to the small alley behind the shop. "Thank you," he whispered, opening the door and stepping outside. The cold wind hit his face. Kevin walked quickly through the dark alley, trying to leave the area before the man noticed. But just as he reached the end of the alley, a figure suddenly appeared right in front of him. Kevin took a step back, but the other man spoke first. "Don't be afraid. I'm not a bad guy." Under the dim streetlight, Kevin got a better look at the man's face. He was in his 30s, tall, with a serious but not threatening face. "Then why are you following me?" Kevin growled, trying to stay calm. The man shrugged. "I'm not after you. I'm after David Miller." Kevin froze. "Who are you?" The man pulled a card out of his pocket and handed it to Kevin. In the yellow light, he read, "Ethan Cole, private investigator." Kevin frowned. "A detective?" Ethan nodded. "I'm investigating David." Kevin felt his heart pound. "You're investigating him? Why?" Ethan stared at him, then sighed. "I don't think you know the whole truth about him." Kevin clenched his fists. "What truth?" Ethan looked around, as if to make sure no one else was listening. Then he said in a low voice, "David Miller may not be who you think he is." Kevin sat in the small coffee shop on the corner, across from Ethan. His mind was reeling from what he had just heard. "I don't understand. Are you saying that David has a dark past?" Ethan nodded. "I'm not suspicious. I have proof." He took out a small envelope and pushed it towards Kevin. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it. The photos fell onto the table. Kevin picked them up, his eyes widening as he recognized what they contained. They were old photos of a group of people at a party. In the center of the photo was David, but he didn't look like the man Kevin had known. He no longer had the gentle, austere look of a former homeless man. In the photo, David was wearing a luxurious suit, holding a glass of wine, smiling smugly. "How long ago was this photo taken?" Kevin asked. Ethan answered immediately. 6 years ago, right before David's company went bankrupt." Kevin frowned. "So what? He used to be rich." Ethan flipped to another photo. "Do you recognize anyone in this one?" Kevin looked closely, then froze. A man standing next to David was Richard Grant. The photo showed the two of them smiling, as if they were close associates. Kevin felt a chill run down his spine. "David said Richard betrayed him," Kevin muttered. Ethan curled his lips. "Betrayed? Maybe. But before that, they were partners in crime." Kevin looked at him suspiciously. "What do you mean?" Ethan put his hands on the table, lowering his voice. "David and Richard worked together on a money laundering scheme. They used the company to hide their illegal money. But then Richard betrayed David, pushing the blame onto him. That's why David lost everything." Kevin felt his mouth dry. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded. "I have all the documents. But the thing is, David isn't as innocent as you think. He's not just a victim." Kevin's head was spinning. Everything he knew about David was suddenly becoming hazy. If what Ethan said was true, what did that mean? Had David come back to start over? Or to continue with another plan? And why did he choose Kevin as his partner? He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He needed to find out the truth. Kevin sat silently, his hand clutching the photo in his hand. What Ethan had just revealed was a blow to his trust in David. "Why are you investigating him?" Kevin asked, his voice low, trying to stay calm. Ethan looked at him for a moment, then took out another file from his bag. He opened a few pages, pushing it towards Kevin. "Do you know about Jonathan Wells?" Ethan asked. Kevin shook his head. "Never heard of him." Ethan curled his lips. "Not surprising. Jonathan Wells used to be David's big partner, but 4 years ago, he disappeared without a trace." Kevin frowned. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" Ethan clasped his hands together, his voice low. "More precisely, he's presumed dead." Kevin felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying David had something to do with his death?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He pushed another photo toward Kevin. This time, it was of a deserted stretch of road. A black car burned out on the side of the road. "This is Jonathan Wells's car," Ethan said. "The police think it was an accident, but there are some unusual things. Jonathan's body was never found. There was some blood in the car, but not enough to confirm his death. Some sources say he may have been murdered." Kevin swallowed. "And you think David was involved?" Ethan sighed. "Jonathan accused David of embezzling investment funds right before he disappeared. When the police started investigating, David also suddenly went bankrupt and disappeared from the business world for a long time. Sounds like a coincidence, doesn't it?" Kevin felt his blood rush faster. What Ethan was saying was making everything terrifyingly confusing, but he still couldn't believe David was a murderer. "I need proof," Kevin said, his voice firm. Ethan nodded. "Me too. And that's why I want you to cooperate with me." Kevin frowned. "Cooperate how?" Ethan leaned his hands on the table, looking straight into Kevin's eyes. "You're the closest person to David right now. I need you to watch him. Find out what he's really doing. If David is truly innocent, then you can prove it. But if he's involved in what I'm investigating, then you better know before it's too late." Kevin was silent, his heart torn. He had believed that David was a respectable man, someone who had gone through hardships to turn his life around. But what Ethan said made him unable to help but doubt. After a while, Kevin sighed. "I'll think about it." Ethan nodded, standing up. "Be careful, Kevin. David is not a simple person." Then he left the cafe, leaving Kevin alone with his chaotic thoughts. That night, when Kevin returned home, he received a text message from David. "We'll meet at the office tomorrow. I have something important to discuss." Kevin stared at the phone screen, his heart heavy. Something important? Could it be related to what Ethan just said? He slowly put the phone down, taking a deep breath. Whatever the truth was, he had to find it. No matter how terrifying the truth was. The next morning, Kevin walked into the office building where David had arranged to meet him. He felt nervous, but he tried to keep his composure. He didn't know what David would say today, but after meeting Ethan last night, he couldn't look at him the same way. David was already there, sitting in a large leather chair in the luxurious office. He looked calm, but Kevin noticed that his eyes were a little more thoughtful than usual. "Sit down, Kevin," David gestured. Kevin sat down in the chair opposite him, his eyes never leaving David. "I called you here because there's something important," David began, his voice low. "I want you to be the CEO of our new company." Kevin was stunned. "What?" David leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "I trust you, Kevin. I've watched the way you work, the way you think. I need someone I can trust to run the company, and you're the one." Kevin felt his heart pounding. This wasn't just a simple offer of cooperation anymore. This was an important position, a big responsibility. But why me? Kevin asked. David smiled. Because I see potential in you, and because I want you around as we take this company from strength to strength. Kevin swallowed. Part of him wanted to believe David, but another part of him was still echoing Ethan's warnings. David, there's something I want to ask you, Kevin said, trying to keep his voice calm. David looked at him, his eyes full of concern. What? Kevin took a deep breath. I've heard about Jonathan Wells. The atmosphere in the room fell immediately. David's gaze sharpened. He leaned back in his chair, silent for a few seconds. Oh, he said slowly. Who did you hear it from? Kevin didn't answer right away. He didn't want to give Ethan away, but he couldn't avoid it either. I did some research, he said. There were rumors about him disappearing, and you being involved. David sighed, his eyes strangely sad. Jonathan Wells is an old friend of mine. We used to work together, but things got complicated. He disappeared, Kevin said, waiting to see David's reaction. David nodded. Yes, and I was one of the last people to see him before it happened. Kevin's heart pounded. So, what really happened? David was silent for a long moment. Jonathan found out that Richard Grant was manipulating our company's finances, David said, his voice low. He wanted to bring it all to light, but before he could do that, he disappeared. Kevin frowned. You mean Richard might have something to do with this? David nodded. I don't have any proof, but I know Richard isn't a simple person. He pushed me off the cliff, and I believe he did the same to Jonathan. Kevin felt a chill run down his spine. If you suspect so much, why don't you investigate? David chuckled. Do you think I don't want to? When my company collapsed, I couldn't even take care of myself. I didn't have the strength to fight him. Kevin looked deep into David's eyes, searching for any signs of deception. But all he saw was exhaustion. What now? He asked. You're back. You have the resources. What are you going to do? David raised an eyebrow. Are you willing to help me? Kevin paused. He didn't know if he could trust David completely. But if what David said was true, then Richard was the one manipulating everything, and possibly behind Jonathan's disappearance. If so, then the person Ethan was investigating, it might not be David, but Richard. Kevin clenched his fists. He needed to find out the truth. Okay, he said. I'll help you. David smiled, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. Then we have a lot of work to do. But Kevin didn't know that as soon as he left the office. Another pair of eyes were watching him. A dark figure stood silently in the parking lot, picking up the phone. He agreed. A deep voice sounded on the other end of the line. Good. Now, let him sink deeper. Kevin walked out of the office building, his mind filled with jumbled thoughts. It seemed like everything had taken a completely new turn. He had decided to help David. But at what cost? Was he truly innocent, or was he just creating a solid cover to hide dark secrets from his past? At this point, the feeling of doubt was stronger than ever. However, he couldn't stop, because once he entered this vortex, he probably wouldn't be able to get out easily. Kevin received a call as he walked out of the building. The caller's voice came through the phone. Kevin, you shouldn't believe anything David says. It was Ethan. Are you following me? Kevin asked, surprised and worried. Not following, but I know what you're going to do, Ethan replied, his voice calm but full of warning. You don't understand what you're getting yourself into. David is not just a betrayed man. He is also a perpetrator of many crimes, and everything around him is a spider web that no one can escape. Kevin clenched his fists on the phone, feeling uneasy. Tell me more, Ethan. I need to know what he is hiding. David is not simply a victim, Ethan said, his voice serious. I can't tell you everything right now, but I will show you what I am investigating. I will meet you at the old coffee shop tonight. Kevin hesitated, but in the end he only managed to say one sentence. Okay. When the call ended, Kevin stood still for a moment, staring into the hazy space of the gray sky. He couldn't stop. Whatever the risks, he had gone too far to turn back. That evening, Kevin went to the old coffee shop where Ethan had arranged to meet. This was where he had first met Ethan, and where things had gotten complicated. Ethan had been sitting in a secluded corner of the shop, his eyes fixed on a laptop. When he saw Kevin enter, he nodded slightly and gestured for Kevin to sit down. "Thank you for coming," Ethan said, his voice calm. "Is there anything important?" Kevin asked, getting straight to the point. Ethan nodded, opened a large file, and pushed it towards Kevin. "What I'm going to show you are the documents I've collected over the past few months. As I suspected, everything related to David is not simple." Kevin glanced through the pages, unable to hide his surprise. Jonathan Wells's photo appeared on the first page, but this time there were a few details that he hadn't noticed before. David wasn't just Richard's co-conspirator in the money laundering. He's been involved in a number of shady financial dealings over the years, Ethan said, looking into Kevin's eyes to gauge his reaction. And Jonathan, he's not the only one who's disappeared because he wanted to expose David. Kevin felt a sharp shock. What? He killed Jonathan? Ethan nodded. Not just Jonathan. At least 3 more people have disappeared or been murdered because they knew too much about David's illegal activities. And don't forget, he hasn't completely escaped his opponents. Opponents? Kevin asked, starting to see more clearly what Ethan meant. Richard and his other partners in the underworld. David is trying to rebuild his company and his reputation, but the price is not small. They won't let him off, Ethan emphasized. Kevin fell silent, thinking about what he had just heard. The image of David in his mind began to change. The man he had seen as an honest man, a victim of life, could now be the one running a shady empire. So, what do you want me to do? Kevin asked. Ethan sighed. I don't want you to fall into this trap. You need to decide before it's too late. David can take advantage of you. He can convince you to join his business, but I advise you to leave him before things get worse. Kevin closed his eyes for a moment. He couldn't just ignore everything that had happened. Not only was there doubt in his heart, but there was also concern for this man. After all, David was the one who had given him an opportunity that he couldn't ignore. But the truth was getting more and more complicated, and he knew he couldn't blindly trust anyone completely. I'll do it my way, Kevin said, his eyes full of determination. Ethan looked at him, silent for a moment, then nodded. I hope you know what you're doing. As Kevin walked out of the cafe, he knew he was about to face bigger challenges. What would happen next? Would he be able to continue working with David without getting caught up in the machinations? Or would he be the one to bring it all to light? He couldn't be sure. But one thing he knew was that his life would never be the same again. Kevin didn't know if he was racing against time or lost in a dangerous maze. Every step he took, every decision he made, was like a gamble with no predictable consequences. Things were no longer as simple as before. After meeting Ethan, he returned home, but instead of finding a clear answer, he felt even more confused. Ethan's words still echoed in his head. Was David really the person Ethan said he was? He was faced with a big question. Should I continue to cooperate with David? Kevin decided to have a frank conversation with David the next morning. He needed to know the truth. He couldn't continue in the dark, couldn't live with doubts like this. A decision had to be made, and if he had to face the unpleasant truth, he would do it. The next morning, when Kevin arrived at David's office, he was there first, sitting behind a large wooden desk, looking out the window as if he were waiting for him. "Hello, Kevin." David smiled, his eyes warm but somehow profound. "Thank you for coming." Kevin nodded, but did not sit down immediately. He stood still for a moment, looking straight into David's eyes. "I need to talk to you about what I heard." His voice was not soft, but firm. David frowned, but then smiled slightly. "What did you hear?" "About Jonathan Wells and what he did in the past," Kevin said bluntly, leaving no room for evasion. David's expression did not change, but his eyes seemed defensive. "Kevin, you're talking about things that happened. Mistakes that I can't change. They're part of my past, and I'm not proud of them." "But I need to know," Kevin said, his voice firm. "Were you involved in Jonathan's disappearance? And what about Richard Grant? Was he really the one who betrayed you?" David fell silent, his eyes growing thoughtful. There was a long moment of silence. Kevin felt the air in the room grow heavy, as if everything were standing still. Finally, David sighed. "Jonathan was my old friend. We worked together for a long time. But when he wanted to bring his dark past to light, I couldn't let that happen. I had to make a decision, and that decision changed everything." His voice suddenly became serious, no longer as calm as before. "What do you mean?" Kevin asked, unable to keep quiet. David looked at Kevin with a determined gaze. "I didn't kill Jonathan, Kevin, but I couldn't stand by and watch him destroy the company and what I had built. If I didn't stop him, it wouldn't just be him who would lose, it would be everyone in the company, the employees I had cared for." Kevin was speechless. He didn't know how to react to this confession. Things weren't as he thought. David wasn't the victim he thought he was. But what did that mean? Should he believe David's explanation? "What about Richard?" Kevin asked, trying to keep his composure. "Isn't he your old friend?" David was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Richard was a partner, but after everything that happened, I can't trust him anymore. He betrayed me, and now I just want to rebuild everything without him." Kevin tried to understand what David was saying, but there were still too many unanswered questions in his mind. Even though David said he had nothing to do with Jonathan's death, how could he know what was true? "So what are we talking about?" Kevin asked, his eyes filled with doubt. "If you didn't kill Jonathan, then where is he?" David leaned back, his hands clenched. "I don't know, Kevin. It's too complicated, but I won't let my past dictate the future of this company." He spoke with a determination that Kevin couldn't deny. Kevin stood still, his mind reeling with the new information. The more he listened, the more he felt like he was being drawn into a game he couldn't control. Was everything he knew about David just a facade? He looked into David's eyes, seeing the exhaustion and determination in them. Part of him wanted to believe him, but part of him feared falling into the trap David had built. "There will be many challenges ahead," David said, breaking the silence. "But if you're with me, I believe we can overcome them all." Kevin didn't answer right away. Every decision he made would affect not only himself, but also those around him. But he knew one thing. He couldn't stand aside. If he wanted to know the truth, he would have to dig deeper. "Okay," Kevin said, finally deciding. "I'll help you. But I want everything to be clear. No more secrets." David smiled, his eyes hopeful. "I know you'll be with me, and I would never do that." "I'm disappointed." But Kevin couldn't know that. As soon as he left the office, a figure was watching him from afar. And the truth about Jonathan, about David, and about all the secrets had yet to be revealed. As Kevin left David's office, an inexplicable feeling filled him. He had decided to move forward with David, but deep down, he couldn't help but wonder if he was walking into a dangerous trap. He felt that the secrets that had yet to be revealed were still looming around him, like invisible but ever-present ghosts. He walked quickly out of the building, his eyes scanning the crowded streets, trying to push away the negative thoughts. After all, he had made a decision now. If he made a mistake, at least it was his decision. But when he turned his head, he saw a figure gliding across the sidewalk, lurking in the darkness. The strange feeling clung to him again. He had seen that figure before. Yes, it was the strange man Ethan had warned him about, the one he had seen last night. He couldn't let this go without finding out more. Kevin decided to follow, keeping a little distance so as not to be discovered. The man quickly turned into a small alley, the dim light from the street lamps only enough to illuminate a few meters ahead. Kevin did not stop, following in silence. The alley gradually became more deserted, and when the man turned into a small shop, Kevin quickly hid in the dark corner, observing. It was an old shop, with faded curtains covering the windows. The man opened the door and entered without looking back, leaving only a light breeze when the door closed. Kevin did not hesitate anymore. He quickly approached the door, gently turned the doorknob. The door was not locked. He opened the door carefully and walked in. Inside was a dark space, only dimly lit by a table lamp. Kevin stood still, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. He heard a faint voice, then a familiar voice spoke, cold and clear. "You're late." Kevin froze. He recognized that it was Richard Grant's voice. "What?" Kevin whispered to himself, not daring to believe his ears. He couldn't listen anymore, but he couldn't leave now. Kevin followed the wall, walking slowly towards the voice. When he reached a corner of the room, he saw Richard sitting across from another man. That man had a calm appearance, but his sharp eyes seemed to penetrate everything. Suddenly, Richard's words made Kevin freeze. "David won't be able to escape this time. We've prepared everything. He will pay for everything." Kevin's heart skipped a beat. Will David pay? He couldn't believe that Richard was plotting something against David, but it had something to do with him. Kevin felt like he was being dragged into a dangerous game from which he couldn't retreat. "Are you sure?" the man sitting across from him asked. His voice was calm, as if everything was just part of a larger plan. "David has been rising from the rubble for too long. It's time to end it all." Kevin felt the air around him thicken. He took a quiet step back, but unfortunately, a chair creaked as he moved. Richard turned to him. "Who's there?" Kevin ran, but before he could get out, Richard stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path. "Where are you going, Kevin?" Richard said, his voice low and menacing. "We can talk for a while. If you want to know the truth, I'm willing to give you a chance." Kevin stood there, eyes bewildered but unable to back down. He knew he had no choice but to face Richard. "What? What do you want?" Kevin asked, his voice tense, but he didn't dare back down. Richard smiled, his eyes shining with meaning. "I know David has told you a lot of things, but I need you to understand one thing, Kevin. He's not who you think he is. If you don't want to be caught up in this game, I advise you to leave him before it's too late. He'll drag you down, and I don't know if you'll ever have the chance to back down again." Kevin took a deep breath, feeling like everything around him had collapsed. Richard was not someone who could be ignored easily, and he was not someone who would say these words without a deeper purpose. "What do you want me to do?" Kevin asked, his heart filled with confusion. Richard did not answer right away, but only stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Kevin. "The choice is yours, Kevin. But if you do not want to fall into this trap, Then listen to me. Kevin stood still, staring at Richard, not knowing what to do. It was not just a choice between right and wrong, but also a battle of trust. If he followed Richard, he might find out the truth about David. But was David really who Richard said he was? "You're not leaving here until you have answers, are you?" Richard asked, his voice low, his eyes sharp. "I won't force you to do anything you don't want to do, Kevin. But if you continue to work with David, you'll put yourself in a situation that no one can save." Kevin felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't want to be forced to choose sides, but Richard's words made him feel like he was standing on a precipice. One wrong move could lead to unpredictable consequences. "What do you want me to do?" Kevin asked, his voice already starting to lose its confidence. Richard smiled coldly. "Think about what David said. He's trying to lure you into a game you can't control. If you want to save yourself, if you don't want to be caught up in the crimes David committed, I'll help you. But I need you to help me." Kevin was silent for a moment, cold sweat running down his forehead. It was no longer about cooperating with David, but about uncovering the truth, a truth that could cost him everything. He couldn't believe how complicated and conspiratorial it all was. "What do you want me to do?" Kevin asked again, his voice firmer this time, determined to find the truth. Richard smiled, his eyes calculating. "I want you to figure this out. You'll have to find a way to lure David into a trap, and we'll expose everything. But I need you on my side, Kevin. Only if you do that can we defeat David." Kevin felt like he was trapped in a game that he couldn't get out of. He didn't want to do this, but if he didn't, would he be able to keep a clear view of David? The feeling of being dragged into this power struggle made him feel like he was sinking into an abyss that he couldn't escape. "So what do I do now?" Kevin asked, full of confusion, but also beginning to realize that things were going too far to stop. Richard leaned forward, then silently took out a thick envelope. "I've prepared everything. These are the documents about David's wrongdoings. If you do as I say, everything will be clear. We'll expose everything." Kevin held the envelope in his hand, feeling like a major change in his life had begun. A decision that could not be reversed. He opened the envelope, examining each document one by one. Each page, each piece of evidence was like a knife cutting into his heart. The crimes, the dark plots that David had committed, all appeared clearly before his eyes. That night, Kevin could not sleep. The thoughts swirled in his head, making him feel heavy, as if he had carried an invisible burden. He needed to face David again, but this time not to continue cooperation, but to challenge him, to force him to confess everything. The next morning, Kevin came to David's office, clutching the documents that Richard had given him. David was still sitting in the office, as if he had prepared everything for this meeting. "Kevin, have you thought carefully about my proposal yesterday?" David asked, his face calm, but his eyes were full of vigilance. Kevin placed the documents on the table in front of David. "I have thought very carefully," he said, his voice firm. "And I think it is time for you to answer my questions." David raised his eyebrows, but said nothing. "Jonathan Wells," Kevin began, "were you involved in his disappearance?" David's expression did not change. "Jonathan worked with me for a long time, but I had nothing to do with his disappearance." "And what about Richard Grant?" Kevin continued, not taking his eyes off David. "Did you know that Richard was the one who plotted to overthrow you?" David stared at Kevin for a long moment, his gaze changing. But then he sighed, looking down at the table. "I know I can't hide it forever," David said quietly, his voice low. "But I can't let this all be exposed. I just want to protect what I've built." Kevin shook his head. "You've made too many enemies, David, and now you can't back down." David stood up, his eyes as sharp as a knife. If I'm going to pay the price, I'm not going to stand by and watch it happen. Kevin realized that he was facing a crucial decision. If he couldn't stop, then Kevin would have to be the one to bring the truth to light. Kevin stood facing David, unable to take his eyes off him. The air in the room seemed thick, so tense that it was palpable. David remained calm, but there was something unsettling in his eyes, as if there was a secret he could no longer hide. "You said I can't back down," Kevin began, his hands clutching the documents. "So what would you do if everything you've done, the secrets you've kept, were exposed?" David took a deep breath, his eyes closing as if he were preparing to face a major decision. "Kevin, what I did was for the company, for the people I love. But there's something I haven't told you." His voice dropped. "Jonathan Wells isn't the one I wanted to kill, but he knows too much. He's forced me into a position where I can't back down." Kevin stared at David, feeling as if he was revealing a part of the truth that he had long been unable to see. "What did you do to Jonathan?" Kevin asked, his voice less patient than before. David stepped back, his eyes never leaving the documents on the table. "Jonathan wanted to come out, and I couldn't let that happen. But I didn't kill him. I just stopped him." "Stopped?" Kevin repeated, his eyes skeptical. "You're talking about killing people." David didn't answer right away. There was a moment of silence, and then he looked up, his eyes now filled with a sadness Kevin had never seen before. "Kevin, I've done things I'm not proud of, but they weren't all as bad as you think. I'm not a bad person. I just wanted to protect what I built." Kevin stood there, his mind reeling from everything he had just said. David was not innocent, but was he really to blame? The events surrounding Jonathan, Richard, and the complicated relationships he had been involved in made it impossible for Kevin to see things simply. "What about Richard?" Kevin asked, his eyes still filled with doubt. "Was he involved in Jonathan's death?" David bowed his head. "Richard is not someone I can trust. He is a traitor, and I know it. But I can't control everything. Kevin, I can't stop when I've gone too far." David's words were like a slap in the face to Kevin's heart. Everything he had believed about this man now seemed to collapse. Everything was not only complicated, but also full of intrigue and lies. David stood up and walked closer to Kevin. "Kevin, I can't change the past, but I can do everything to protect you. You're the only one I trust right now." Kevin shook his head, trying to clear his mind. He couldn't just believe everything David said. Even if David wasn't completely evil, everything he'd done made it impossible for him to fully convince Kevin. "You've gone too far, David," Kevin said, his voice filled with exhaustion. "I can't continue with you." David looked at him with an unreadable gaze. "Kevin, I understand. But if you leave, will you still want to know the truth? Will you be able to let go of everything that happened?" Kevin stood still for a long time. Then finally he turned away, his decision clear. "I will find out the truth, my way," he said, and walked out of the room, not looking back at David again. Kevin returned to his life, but everything had changed. He could not ignore what he knew, the secrets David had revealed, and Ethan's words about finding the truth. He could not return to his previous quiet life. He began to search for every clue, investigating Jonathan, Richard, and what was really going on in the company. One morning, while Kevin was in the office, he received a call. The voice on the other end of the line said, "If you want to know the truth about Jonathan, I can help you. But you have to come see me now." It was an invitation to a meeting that could change everything. And this time, no one could predict what would happen next Kevin felt a chill run down his spine when he heard that voice on the other end of the line. Although he had thought he had found out everything he could about David and the secrets surrounding Jonathan, this call opened another door, a twist that had not been revealed. "Are you sure?" Kevin asked, his voice uncertain. "Who are you?" "Don't worry. I'm someone Jonathan trusts," the voice assured, soft and seductive. "If you want to know the truth about Jonathan's death, about what David did, I can help you. But there is one condition." Kevin paused. "What condition?" "You have to meet me alone, and you have to be willing to hear the truth, even if it means you can't go back." The words were a warning, but at the same time they piqued his curiosity. He couldn't let this opportunity go, couldn't let the unanswered questions haunt him forever. "Okay," Kevin said, his voice determined. "Where?" That afternoon, Kevin drove to a deserted area outside the city. The scenery was gradually thinning out, the city lights fading, giving way to darkness. He stopped in front of an old house, hidden on a small street, not a single person passing by. The house looked like it had not been repaired for a long time. The windows were opaque. There was no sign of life. Kevin felt nervous with every step, but he had no choice. He approached the door, his finger brushed the doorknob, then pushed the old wooden door. The door opened gently, as if waiting for him. Inside, the space was dark and quiet, only the sound of insects and the light wind outside the window. He stepped in, his eyes looking around, but saw no one. For a moment he wondered if this was a trap. "Kevin, I'm here," the voice echoed from a dark corner of the room. Kevin turned to see a man in his 50s, with a stoic look and sharp eyes staring straight at him. The man looked familiar, as if he had seen him somewhere before, but he couldn't immediately place it. "I'm Thomas," the man said, interrupting Kevin's thoughts. "Jonathan was my friend, and I have something you need to know." Kevin stepped closer, doubtful but unable to back away. "I need to know the truth about Jonathan, about his death and what David did." Thomas nodded, his expression serious. "Jonathan discovered something very big about David. He was more than just a small businessman. David's entire company, his relationships, were all built on lies, even illegality." Kevin stood still, each word Thomas said like a blow to the trust he had built up over the years. "David isn't who I thought he was, is he?" "No," Thomas said immediately. "David was a schemer, and Jonathan knew it. He had a plan to bring everything to light. But David stopped him, and things got darker. What David was doing wasn't to restore the company, but to protect himself from secrets that would destroy everything." Kevin felt like everything inside him was collapsing. Jonathan wanted to bring everything to light? But why did he disappear? Jonathan didn't die in an accident. He was captured by David and then erased from everything. Thomas paused for a second, then continued, his voice strained. "People like Jonathan aren't just killed. They're erased from view." Kevin stood rooted to the spot, his mind reeling from what he'd just heard. Everything he knew about David was no longer reliable. He may have created false truths, and now he was caught in a spiral that he could not control. "Does David know that I know all this?" Kevin asked, his voice becoming serious. Thomas smiled, but it was not a happy smile. "I don't know. But if you want to continue this game, if you want to expose everything, you have to act quickly. David is trying to do everything he can to keep this secret. You can be the one to bring the truth to light, or you can be part of the deception." Kevin looked at Thomas, his heart sinking. This fight was not just about David's company or the money he had lost, but about the truth itself. And he knew that, no matter the cost, He could not let these secrets remain hidden. Kevin left Thomas's house with a mixed feeling. Everything seemed too complicated now, but he couldn't go back. The pieces of David, Jonathan, and Richard's story had gradually been filled in, and now he had to face the final truth. That night, when Kevin got home, he sat down at the table, his face tired and full of thoughts. He couldn't stop. Everything was too complicated, but he couldn't back down. He needed to face David again, and this time not to ask, but to threaten that the truth would come to light. He knew he couldn't trust anyone completely in this game, but David was the only one he could face to find out the truth. Richard? Ethan? They were just small pieces in the big picture, and now it was time for Kevin to write the ending of the story himself. The next day, Kevin went to see David at the office as usual, but this time he couldn't keep his composure. Everything had changed, and he could feel the tension in the air. David sat behind his desk, his eyes tired, as if he had been preparing for this conversation for a long time. When Kevin entered, he did not stand up, only nodded slightly, as if he had been waiting for him. "Kevin, I know you know everything." David spoke, his voice low and accepting. "Nothing can be hidden from you anymore." Kevin stood still for a moment, then said coldly, "I did not come here to ask you any more questions. I came here to make a decision." David looked at him, his eyes no longer deceitful or scheming. "I cannot change the past, Kevin, but I can give you a future. You can help me, and I will not let you down." "No, you cannot," Kevin said bluntly. "You have gone too far. The truth cannot be hidden forever. You have deceived me, David, and I cannot continue to help you." David stood up, his eyes hardening. "Kevin, if you want to clear things up, I won't stop. But I won't let this truth destroy everything I've built. I'll protect the company, protect what I've achieved." "How?" Kevin asked, his voice suddenly cold. "Are you going to kill me like you did Jonathan?" David stepped closer, his eyes shining with determination. "I didn't kill Jonathan, Kevin, but I had to stop him before it was too late. And now, if you don't stand by me, I won't let you destroy everything." Kevin couldn't take these words anymore. He knew that, even if David truly loved this company and wanted to protect it, things had gone too far. If he didn't stop, David would destroy himself and everyone he cared for. Kevin stood up straight, his eyes determined. "I will not be dragged into this trap again. The truth will come out, whether you like it or not." David looked at Kevin threateningly, but there was also a hint of disappointment in his eyes. "You don't understand, Kevin. I did everything for the people I loved. I will not stop." Kevin turned away, feeling a coldness envelop him. He walked out of David's office for the last time, but he knew he had made the right decision. Nothing was more important than the truth, no matter the cost. That night, Kevin met Ethan again. He did not want to prolong this game any longer. He had prepared everything to bring David to light. From the documents Thomas had given him, the investigations he had done, he had enough evidence to confront David and expose everything. "David betrayed everyone," Kevin said to Ethan as they sat across from each other. "I will bring it all to light. I cannot let him continue to deceive everyone." Ethan looked at him, his eyes filled with sympathy, but also a little worried. "You did the right thing, Kevin. But remember, if you do that, David will not forgive you. He has done so much to protect himself." Kevin took a deep breath, his eyes determined. "I am prepared. No one can hide the truth forever." Finally, Kevin took the decisive step. With the support of Ethan and the documents he had collected, he brought all the evidence to the authorities. The truth about David, about Jonathan, about the crimes that had been committed, all came to light. Those who had been deceived by David, including former colleagues and partners, realized that they could no longer blindly trust him. David, whom Kevin had once trusted and considered a friend, now had to face the inevitable consequences. The entire company he built no longer exists, and the dark secrets he kept hidden have been exposed. This story wants to emphasize that, although life can be complicated and difficult, the truth always has the power to overcome all challenges. Sometimes we will be faced with difficult choices, hidden secrets, and it is the courage to find the truth that can bring justice and peace of mind. No matter how small an action is, if done with a sincere heart, it will create great changes. Don't let any lies obscure the light of truth in your life. If this story touches your heart, please share and spread this message to those around you. Together, we can create a more just world, where truth is respected and courage is affirmed. Click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Don't forget to share your story in the comments section. Every story is worth listening to. Turn on notifications to follow more inspiring stories, because only the truth can bring true freedom. Be the one to help spread the truth. Star.